Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're not just talking about food. We're going on an archaeological dig. We're unearthing a lost culinary civilization, one that existed not in ancient ruins, but in the steamy kitchens of factory towns, in the cramped galleys of military camps, and on the dusty plains of the Depression-era heartland. What does hardship taste like? What is the flavor of resilience? Tonight, we're going to find out. These are the meals born from calloused hands, muddy boots, and 12-hour shifts. They were built to feed the men and women who built everything else. These were heavy, honest, and engineered to last. Now, largely forgotten, gathering dust in the attic of our collective memory, these working man's dinners are ready for one more round at the table. You could smell it before you even turned the corner onto the block. A scent that was part smoke, part soul, part savory promise, bubbling away in a chipped enamel pot on the back burner of a stove that had seen better. Ham hocks and cabbage. This wasn't a dish. It was an economic statement. In a world where prime cuts were for the bosses, the hock, the tough, bony, awkward joint from the lower leg of the pig was the people's protein. It was dirt cheap, often considered little more than a flavouring agent. Cabbage was even cheaper, a humble vegetable that grew in abundance and stored for ages. But when these two underdogs were slow cooked together in a simmering pot of water, they underwent a kind of alchemy. They created something far greater, far more profound than the sum of their humble parts. The magic was in the time. Hours upon hours of low, slow heat would break down the tough collagen in the hock, transforming the stubborn meat into something buttery soft, something that would surrender and fall from the bone with the gentlest nudge of a spoon. The cabbage, meanwhile, would wilt and sweeten, losing its raw crunch and eagerly soaking up every last drop of that smoky, salty, deeply porky broth until each leaf was a translucent vessel of flavour. This was the epitome of end-of-the-day food. There was no fuss, no frantic chopping, no array of measuring cups and spoons cluttering the counter. You didn't consult a cookbook. The recipe was etched into muscle memory. You threw it all in the pot, let it go, and by the time the sun dipped below the factory smokestacks, dinner was ready. It was a liquid savings account, a meal that families could stretch over several days. Sometimes, a handful of dried beans would be tossed in to add bulk. Other times, it was just more water, and somehow, it still worked. If there was bread, you didn't just dip it, you performed a full baptism, ensuring every porous crumb was saturated. If not, you slurped every last bit straight from the bowl. This dish filled stomachs, quieted complaints, and gave people just enough inner warmth to face the biting cold of the next morning. And just when you think a meal couldn't get more resourceful, someone out there was taking the concept of living off the land to its most literal conclusion. They were braising rabbits in cast iron, turning a common backyard pest into a centerpiece. This wasn't just food, it was survival dressed in a sprig of rosemary and a whole lot of patience. In an era when a steak was a distant dream, rabbits were the working man's protein. They were lean, they were surprisingly plentiful, and they were often running around just beyond your back door, a twitching, furry symbol of the thin line between nuisance and necessity. The dish of braised rabbit with root vegetables came from a place where you used what you had, and you wasted absolutely nothing. You'd see folks' fathers, sons, even daughters coming back from a quiet morning hunt, not with a trophy buck, but with 1 or 2 rabbits. The process was swift and practiced. They'd be skinned in minutes, the work of knowing hands, and the pot would be on the heat. The rabbit meat, lean and delicate, would get a quick, hard sear in a little lard or bacon fat to develop a deep brown crust. Then, it would be settled into a long, slow soak in a broth, surrounded by whatever root vegetables the garden could spare. Carrots for sweetness, turnips for a peppery bite, onions for a savoury foundation. You didn't need much else. The magic was in the slow, moist heat, which tenderized the lean muscle until it was succulent and yielding. The pot would stay warm on the back of the stove, and the unwritten rule was that anyone passing through a neighbour, a relative down on their luck got a bowl. That was just how it worked. This dish has largely vanished with time, a casualty of our mass migration from rural life to urban convenience. But for those who remember it, this meal carries a certain weight. It was the kind of dinner that reminded you, in the most visceral way, how tough and how tender life could be, all at the same time. Now, let's pivot from the tender to the challenging. The something a little more vinegary, a little more jiggly, and a whole lot more polarizing. You either loved them with a fierce, unwavering loyalty, or you looked the other way, pretending they didn't exist. Pickled pig's feet. This was the kind of food that dared you to try it. It was a test of culinary courage, and if you passed, you probably came back for seconds and thirds and a lifetime of defending their honor. They were unapologetically tangy, profoundly gelatinous, and surprisingly rich in a way that defied their humble origins. It all started with a jar, sitting on the corner of a dusty, sun-drenched bar or on a neighbor's kitchen shelf like a specimen in a mad scientist's laboratory. Inside, the pale, almost ghostly feet soaked in a clear brine of vinegar, garlic, salt, and pickling spices for days, sometimes weeks, transforming from an undesirable cut into a preserved delicacy. When they finally hit your plate, they usually came with a humble escort. A few boiled potatoes, their starchy, neutrality a perfect foil to the foot's aggressive tang. No one was pretending this was pretty food. It was real. It was visceral. This was collagen-heavy, protein-rich, and brimming with a kind of working-class pride that simply did not care what you thought of it. The boiled potatoes were essential. They mellowed out the sharp, acidic punch of the vinegar, providing a soft, comforting counterpoint to the chewy, cartilaginous texture of the feet. Together, they made for a meal that was, against all odds, weirdly comforting. It was a dish that spoke of preservation, of making things last, of finding flavor and sustenance in the most overlooked corners of the butchering block. Of course, not everyone was a convert. Some preferred to keep their meals a little more tame, like, for instance, slicing up yesterday's dinner and tucking it between two slices of bread. This was the blue-collar bento box, the original grab-and-go meal. The cold meatloaf sandwich was the ultimate second-day win, a masterclass in culinary reincarnation. Born from the leftovers of a meal already designed to stretch, it gave every slice a second shot at greatness. The architecture was simple but perfect: a thick, cold slab of meatloaf, a decisive squeeze of sharp yellow mustard, and 2 pieces of the softest, most unassuming white bread you could find. That was it. But when done right, it contained all the comfort of a warm, home-cooked meal without ever having to touch the stove. You could eat it leaning against a truck on a job site, sitting at the kitchen table, in the quiet of the afternoon, or straight from a metal lunch pail. Kids loved its simplicity, adults depended on its convenience, and no one complained because it just worked. The magic happened overnight, in the refrigerator. The fat in the loaf would firm up, giving the slice a satisfying density. The seasonings, the onion, the garlic, the herbs would meld and deepen. The mustard wasn't just a condiment, it was a wake-up call. A sharp, vinegary slash of flavor cutting through the rich, savory loaf. Some folks might toss in a pickle for a briny crunch, others swore by a thin slice of raw onion for an extra layer of bite, but the foundation never changed. It was humble, it was dependable, and for reasons that defy culinary logic, it was somehow, always, indisputably better the next day. And speaking of budget-friendly second chances, let's talk about a dish that turned one of the most overlooked parts of a chicken into a meal that stuck with you, both in memory and to your ribs. You knew this dish was being cooked the second you heard that specific sizzle hit the pan. Chicken livers, diced onions, and chopped bell peppers all pan-fried together until the kitchen smelled like a Sunday feast on a Tuesday night. This dish was loud in flavor, but soft on the wallet. Livers were, and still are, nutritional powerhouses packed with iron, protein, and a deep, earthy flavor, but they came cheap because most people, frankly, were a little squeamish about them. That was their loss and the working family's gain. The preparation was a lesson in efficiency. The rice, cooked separately, was the canvas and the stretcher, making a small amount of liver feel like a banquet. The onions and peppers, sorted until soft, gave it texture and a crucial hit of sweetness that balanced the rich, almost metallic tang of the livers. The whole thing came together in under 30 minutes, a godsend for a tired parent after a long shift. You could make it with one burner and a single skillet. No need for a whole battery of pots and pans. Some cooks, feeling bold, would toss in a generous amount of minced garlic or a few dashes of hot sauce to give it an extra kick. Every bite was rich but not heavy, savory but not overdone. It filled you up, it kept you going, and it often left a little extra for lunch the next day. It was the kind of food that made the most out of the least, and for folks living paycheck to paycheck. That skill wasn't just clever cooking, it was everything. Now, if you thought that was clever, wait until you see what people did with a handful of ground beef and a hollowed-out bell pepper. On the surface, it looked almost fancy, like something you'd serve to company. But at its heart, It was all about the math. Stuffed bell peppers with ground beef and rice were a form of culinary trigonometry, a delicious equation that turned 1 pound of meat into a satisfying meal for 5, maybe even 6 people. The trick was in the filler. The rice was the ultimate extender, bulking up the filling and making the precious ground beef go further. The peppers themselves weren't just a vegetable, they were edible, biodegradable containers, holding everything together. You'd start by browning the beef, then folding in cooked rice and maybe adding a spoonful of tomato paste or a dash of dried herbs from the pantry. This mixture was then packed into the hollowed-out peppers like you were packing, little suitcases for a flavorful journey. Into the oven they went, bubbling away in whatever sauce you could whip together from pantry scraps, sometimes a thin tomato sauce, sometimes a simple broth, sometimes just water and seasoning. The beauty of this dish was its all-in-one nature. Every bite gave you meat, starch and vegetable. No side dish was needed, which meant fewer dishes to wash. For families constantly tightening their belts, this was more than just dinner. It was a strategy. It created leftovers without looking like leftovers, and it was ridiculously easy to scale up if unexpected cousins showed up at the door. There was always room to improvise. Some folks added breadcrumbs or a sprinkle of cheese on top if they had any to spare. Others chopped up leftover vegetables to bulk up the filling even more. But what mattered most was that it filled you up, tasted like home, and made something substantial out of almost nothing. It was budget brilliance in a baking dishot. Hearty and proudly humble. And when meat was even scarcer, when even ground beef felt like a splurge, families got creative with another underdog cut. Something bony, something overlooked, but something packed with a deep, profound flavor if you treated it with the one currency they had in abundance, patience. It wasn't the kind of meat you bragged about buying, but oxtail brought a quiet, confident richness to the table without needing to say a word. Once considered scraps, fit only for stock pots, oxtails became the unsung heroes of slow-cooked meals in kitchens that knew how to work with time instead of money. The process began by browning the bony pieces in a big, heavy pot bone, fat, and until the kitchen filled with that deep, almost primal savory smell. Then came the aromatic foundation, chopped onions, garlic, maybe some rough chopped carrots, all tossed into the mix to soften in the rendered fat. Water or a simple broth followed, and then you just waited. Hours. Usually. But the result was a testament to the transformative power of low and slow cooking. The meat softened, pulling away from the bone in tender ribbons. The broth, enriched by the collagen and marrow from the bones, thickened into a silky, luxurious elixir. If you added barley, it would swell and add a satisfying, chewy weight to every spoonful. This wasn't just a soup. It was sustenance. It was a meal in a bowl. You didn't need sides, just a deep spoon and maybe a torn-off piece of crusty bread to perform the sacred duty of cleaning the bowl. It was food that rewarded patience, that turned a cheap, tough cut into something you genuinely looked forward to. And in homes where leftovers were a critical part of the weekly budget, this stew tasted even better the next day. Reheated on the stove with a splash of water, it was a delicious reminder to use every part, to throw nothing away, and to cook with care. But life wasn't all slow-simmered stews. When the weekend called for something fried, fast, and just a little bit fancier, folks pulled out a shallow pan, some breadcrumbs, and a thin slice of veal that made dinner feel like payday, even if it wasn't. This was the affordable upgrade you didn't see coming. Breaded veal cutlets were thin, crispy, and golden quick to cook and even quicker to please. You take a cheap, thin slice of veal, pound it even thinner to ensure tenderness, then put it through the classic 3-step breading station, a dredge in flour, a dip in beaten egg, then a generous coating of seasoned breadcrumbs. You'd lay it gently in a hot skillet slick with shimmering oil or butter. It sizzled on contact, the crust forming almost instantly, turning a beautiful golden brown while the inside stayed soft and tender. It wasn't a thick, juicy steak, but it had crunch, it had flavor, and it had a certain kind of simple class. The breading soaked up seasoning beautifully, and each bite tasted like effort and expense, even if the whole process only took a few minutes. And beside it, the perfect partner in crime, a fluffy scoop of instant mashed potatoes, creamy and piping hot, with a generous knob of butter melting into a golden pool on top. Sometimes there was a simple pan gravy made from the skillet drippings, sometimes not. But the cutlet, with its crunchy armor, could hold its own. For families juggling time, bills, and hungry mouths, it was a decisive win every single time. But not every night was cutlets and buttered mash. Sometimes you had to go into full casserole mode, opening cans, smashing crackers and letting the oven do all the talking. You'd end up with a baked dinner that smelled like 3 different parts of the country all packed into one glorious, bubbling dish. This one came straight out of the pantry and into the oven, a testament to speed, ease, and a very specific kind of comfort. You'd brown a pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the fat, and toss in a can of corn drained and a scoop of tomato paste or a can of tomato sauce, whatever you had on hand. A few shakes of chili powder gave it a gentle, smoky kick, while chopped onions or peppers, if available, added a bit of texture. Once mixed, the whole savoury concoction went into a baking dish. And here came the best part, the part that elevated it from a simple slurry to a true casserole, the topping. This was a point of regional and familial pride. Some folks swore by a blanket of crushed saltine crackers for a salty, crispy crust. Others leaned toward crumbled cornbread or a quick, pourable batter of cornmeal and milk that would puff up into a golden, cake-like blanket. The resulting flavours were a comforting jumble of sweet, salty, and just a little bit smoky. It didn't try to be authentic Tex-Mex. It just needed to be good. And it was. It was filling, deeply satisfying, and could feed a whole family on less than 10 minutes of actual prep time. Leftovers held up beautifully, too, and somehow the flavours seemed to meld and deepen overnight in the fridge. This was the meal you made when you wanted comfort without complication. And sometimes, the most comforting thing of all came straight from a can. Creamed tuna on egg noodles was one of those meals that looked profoundly plain on the plate, but managed to hit all the right notes of savoury, creamy, and carb-heavy satisfaction. You started by making a simple white sauce, a bechamel in its most stripped-down form. Melted butter in a pan, a spoonful of flour whisked into form a paste, then milk poured in slowly, whisking constantly until it thickened into a smooth, velvety, lump-free base. Into that creamy pool went a drained can of tuna, flaked and briny, along with a pinch of salt, a generous grinding of black pepper, and sometimes a little garlic powder if you had it. Frozen peas were frequent guest stars, tossed in at the end to add a pop of colour and just enough sweetness to cut through the richness of the cream. The egg noodles, wide and ribbon-like, would be boiling away in a separate pot. Cooked until soft but not soggy, they were drained and then tossed right into the sauce. Everything coated, everything warm, everything deeply, profoundly comforting. This was budget cooking at its most elemental. Pantry cooking. Depression-proof cooking. A few cans from the shelf, a bag of noodles, a splash of milk, and dinner was on the table. Kids liked it because it was soft and mild. Grown-ups appreciated it because it filled the hungry gap between now and the next payday. It might not win any culinary beauty contests, but it showed up when it counted, a reliable friend in a world of uncertainty. And when you had just enough money for one solid, substantial pot of food, you'd reach for a cut of meat that required hours of boiling but would yield a dish that defined the factory town kitchens of the Northeast. It was simply called boiled dinner, but the name, stark and utilitarian, didn't quite capture how deeply satisfying it really was. You started with a hefty slab of corned beef, salty, brined, and tough as leather until you gave it hours to surrender and soften. Into the biggest pot in the house it went, covered in water and set on a low, patient boil. Then came the vegetables, added in stages like performers in a slow-motion play. Whole potatoes, scrubbed but unpeeled. Big, hearty chunks of cabbage, layered in like leafy bricks. Carrots, peeled and cut thick, tossed in once the broth had started to pick up some colour and flavour from the beef. The smell would fill the small kitchen rich and peppery from the corned beef spices, with that sharp, unmistakable, slightly sulphurous scent of cabbage cooked just right. When it was finally served, the tender beef would be sliced thick against the grain, arranged on a platter surrounded by the soft, broth-infused vegetables. Some would slather a sharp, spicy mustard on the beef, others would mash the potatoes with a fork and a knob of butter. It was a full plate with nothing fancy and nothing missing. It was a staple in New England, but its simple, one-pot logic found its way into factory towns across the country, feeding large families with a lot of patience. This wasn't special occasion food. It was dependable, built for repetition. And the leftovers were a gift that kept on giving, making incredible sandwiches, hash, and soups that could last well into the week. But sometimes you wanted the illusion of a steak without the steakhouse price tag. You wanted gravy, mashed potatoes, and a nod to classic diner-style comfort. Salisbury steak was the closest many families ever got to a real steak, and honestly, nobody complained. You'd take ground beef, a great equalizer of American kitchen sand, mix it with breadcrumbs to stretch it, an egg to bind it, and seasonings like salt, pepper, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone had splurged. You'd shape this mixture into oval patties, flattened just enough to get a good, dark sear, in a hot skillet. Once they were browned on both sides, you'd set them aside and build the real star of the show, the mushroom gravy. A couple of sliced mushrooms, maybe some onions if you had them, would be sorted in the beef drippings until soft and golden. Then, a sprinkle of flour to soak up the fat, followed by broth or water, stirred and scraped until a smooth, bubbling gravy was born. The patties were then returned to the pan, nestled back into the gravy to simmer gently until they had soaked up every drop of that savoury flavour. The gravy would thicken, the meat would stay juicy, and the whole skillet would look like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting of a roadside diner. On the side, frozen peas, of course, boiled or buttered depending on the mood, and mashed potatoes, which could come from a box or from scratch, depending on the available reserves of time and energy. It wasn't fancy food. It didn't have to be. It was hot. It was filling. And it felt like a genuine treat, even on a Tuesday night. But if you were cooking Southern style, and that precious meat needed to be stretched even further, you'd reach for something bony, flavourful, and quietly legendary in home kitchens. Pork neck bones were never the first choice at the butcher counter, but for many, they were the smartest. They were cheap, they were packed with flavour locked away in the bone and connective tissue, and they were sold in big packs that could form the foundation of countless home-cooked meals. First, you'd brown the bones in hot oil until the fat crisped up and the smell started pulling people into the kitchen. Then came the chopped onions, stirred right into the drippings, sizzling as they picked up every bit of that precious browned flavour stuck to the bottom of the pan. Water or a thin broth would follow, poured in to deglaze the pot and begin the long, slow simmer. Over time, the same magic that worked on oxtails would happen here. The meat would soften and loosen from the bone, and the cooking liquid would transform into a savoury, silky gravy. Some cooks would stir in a little flour or cornstarch slurry for extra body, while others would just let it cook down naturally. That gravy alone was worth the wait. You'd pour it generously over a bed of hot, fluffy white rice, letting it soak up every drop. Add a biscuit, some simmered greens, or just a few slices of plain white bread on the side, and dinner was done. It was a lesson in extracting flavour from the overlooked. And if there wasn't enough meat to go around, oats would step in to help. This wasn't just meatloaf. This was meatloaf that knew how to make do. When breadcrumbs ran low or had gone stale, simple, uncooked oatmeal stepped up. And it didn't just hold the loaf together, it added a wonderful, hearty texture, a subtle nuttiness, and it stretched a single pound of ground meat further than you'd ever think possible. You'd start with the ground beef, crack in an egg, pour in a bit of milk, and then in went the oatstry, simple and ready to soak up every drop of flavour. A pinch of salt, some black pepper, and if you were lucky, a chopped onion for a little extra punch. You'd press it all into a loaf pan, slap on a generous, non-negotiable layer of ketchup across the top, and bake it until the edges pulled away from the pan and the ketchup topping had turned into a dark, caramelized, sweet and tangy glaze. It wasn't flashy, but it was as dependable as the sunrise. Sliced thick and served with canned green beans or mashed potatoes, this loaf kept everyone at the table full and quiet. When even ground beef was a stretch, and the budget demanded a deeper dive into the butcher's less popular offerings, you turned to a forgotten favourite that most people today have never even considered cooking. It was lean, muscular, and packed with an intense flavour, if you only knew how to treat it right. Slow-cooked beef heart was not exactly a showstopper cut, but it had grit. This was a Depression-era choice, not because people craved the taste, but because it was incredibly cheap and readily available. You'd start by trimming it carefully, slicing it into manageable chunks and browning those in a big pot with whatever fat you had on hand. Then came the broth or water, just enough to cover, and often a few bay leaves or a splash of vinegar to help break down the tough muscle and deepen the flavour. It would simmer on low for hours, a quiet, patient process, until the dense heart muscle softened into something tender, rich, and surprisingly comforting. Parsnips were a common addition, their sweet, earthy note providing the perfect balance to the intensity of the organ meat. Served with bread, rice, or just eaten straight from the bowl, it warmed you up from the inside out. It wasn't glamorous, but it didn't have to be. It was an honest meal made from a humble cut, a quiet triumph for those who had learned to cook with what they had. But when you needed something a little crispier, something slathered in a rich, creamy gravy, you reached for a skillet and a pack of pork chops ready to be smothered. Smothered pork chops were not just a dish, they were an experience. You'd take thick, bone-in chops, give them a good, hard sear in a hot pan and let them sizzle until the fat started to render and crisp up. Then came the real magic. You'd remove the chops, and into that pan of glorious pork drippings, you'd sprinkle a little flour, add a splash of broth or water, and maybe a pinch of whatever spices you had on hand. This simple act turned that pan of mess into a silky, savoury gravy that would hug every inch of the meat. The chops went back into the pan, were covered, and simmered on low until they were fork-tender and swimming in flavour. This was white bread food. The kind of dish that demanded you sop up every last bit of that gravy with a slice torn from the plastic bag loaf sitting on the counter. No one left the table hungry, and no one, under any circumstances, left sauce on the plate. When meat was missing entirely and the pantry shelves were looking sparse, you could always count on a can or two and a box of cornbread mix to come through in the clutch. Canned tamale pie was the kind of dish that came together from memory, not a recipe card. It was pantry magic, a Tex-Mex-inspired comfort food built on whatever you had in the cupboard and stretched far enough to feed everyone. You'd brown a pound of ground beef, if you had it, then add a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or tomato sauce and stir in chili powder, cumin, or just a big shake of paprika if that's all there was. Maybe a can of kidney beans made it in there too. You'd pour this savoury mixture into a baking dish, and the best part came next, a cornbread topping, mixed from a box, poured right on top like a golden blanket. The dish would bake until the topping was puffed and golden brown, the filling bubbling up around the edges. You'd scoop it out in steaming spoonfuls, each one packed with seasoned beef, spice, sweet corn, and fluffy cornbread. This was survival food dressed in its Sunday best. And if you loved the flavour of stuffed cabbage but didn't have the time or the patience to meticulously roll each leaf like Grandma did, you could just toss everything into a single casserole dish and still end up with something that tasted like home. This was cabbage rolls without the rolling. Lazy Man's stuffed cabbage was a weeknight hack that delivered all the flavour without any of the fuss. You'd cook ground beef with chopped onions and garlic, mix it with cooked rice, salt, pepper, and tomato sauce. But instead of folding it into tidy bundles, you'd layer it all in a dish, a layer of chopped cabbage, a layer of the meat and rice mixture, more cabbage, more meat, and so on, like a savoury lasagna. As it baked, the tomato sauce would soak into the rice, the beef would meld with the cabbage, and the whole dish would turn into a bubbling, steamy, fork-tender delight. It didn't look fancy, but it smelled like Sunday dinner in a house with 5 kids and no chance of leftovers. If cabbage wasn't your thing, and you needed to whip something up with dry pasta, canned tomatoes, and whatever bacon grease was left in the jar by the stove, you could pull off a Southern pantry classic in under 20 minutes. Macaroni and tomatoes with bacon drippings was the kind of dish that made a meal out of almost nothing. You'd boil some elbow macaroni until just tender, drain it, and toss it straight into a hot skillet slicked with that precious leftover bacon grease. That smoky, savoury flavour would cling to every piece of pasta, even if there wasn't a single crumble of actual bacon in the mix. Next, in would go a can of diced or stewed tomatoes, juice and all, stirred in and simmered just long enough to heat through. A little salt, a little black pepper, maybe a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity of the tomatoes. Every house had its own subtle variation, but even in its simplest form, this dish hit home. It was smoky, tangy, and somehow both rich and light. It was the kind of food you made when the fridge was nearly empty, but dinner still had to happen. When there was a little chicken left, a scoop of sour cream, and a heavy hand with the paprika, you could pull off a dish that felt like it came from another country, even if you made it on a Wednesday in Oyo. Hungarian chicken paprikash was bold, comforting, and built on just a handful of ingredients that transformed into something far more than the sum of their parts. You'd start with bone-in chicken pieces, legs, thighs, a whole cut-up burr browned in a deep skillet until the skin crisped. Then came the sliced onions, sorted down until golden, right before the key ingredient was added, paprika. And not just a sprinkle. A generous, heaping, vibrant red handful that turned everything a deep, earthy crimson. A bit of flour went in to thicken the sauce, followed by water or broth. Just before serving, a generous scoop of sour cream would be stirred into the pan, giving the sauce a rich, velvety, tangy finish. You'd spoon it over wide egg noodles, the perfect buttery vehicles for soaking up every last bit of that glorious sauce. It wasn't about flair, it was about flavour deep, smoky, tangy and hearty. When chicken itself was out of reach, or you needed something heartier on a budget, there was always a way to take pork, turn it into drumsticks and serve it on a stick like a backyard barbecue on a weeknight. Mock chicken legs, better known in old factory towns as city chicken, were the ultimate food illusion. It was pork or veal, cut into cubes, squid tightly on wooden sticks, then breaded and fried to look just like a chicken drumstick. There was no actual chicken involved, and no one minded one bit. This dish was born in butcher shops where pork was cheaper than poultry, but presentation still mattered. The meat was stacked tight, dipped in egg, rolled in breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, and then pan-fried or oven-baked until golden and crisp. The result was juicy meat on a stick with a crunchy shell that made you forget it was anything but chicken. It was kid-friendly, lunchbox ready, and looked just fancy enough to feel like a treat on a tight budget. And when there wasn't time to score or bread anything, and the pantry only offered up ground beef and a box of instant potatoes, you could still bring diner-style comfort to the table with one skillet and a whole lot of gravy. Hamburger gravy on mashed potatoes was a meal that didn't need an introduction. It just needed a fork. You'd start by browning a pound of ground beef in a skillet until it was cooked through and crumbly. You'd push the meat to the side, whisk in a spoonful of flour right into the drippings, and then slowly add milk or water, stirring constantly as it bubbled and thickened into a rich, creamy, beef-flecked gravy. You'd pour it straight over a generous scoop of mashed potato, sometimes from scratch, sometimes from a box, but always hot and waiting. The gravy would seep through the potatoes, and every bite was pure, simple satisfaction. Frozen peas, the classic sidekick, were often boiled, buttered, or just microwaved and dumped right on the plate. The whole meal came together in 20 minutes flat, a working family's go-to for a reason. Then there were times when dinner needed to look like something special, maybe even a centerpiece. Times when people got bold, broke out the ring mold, and made something truly unforgettable from a couple of cans and a whole lot of mid-century nostalgia. It sounded strange, and it looked even stranger, but the tuna noodle ring mold earned its place at the dinner table. You'd take cooked egg noodles and fold them into a creamy mixture of canned tuna, peas, and mayonnaise or cream of mushroom soup. This whole concoction went into a greased ring mold, was packed down tight, and baked until just firm enough to hold its shape. Then came the moment of truth, the flip. It would land on a plate with a satisfying thud, steaming and oddly proud of itself, often topped with a dusting of paprika like it was dressed for a party. It sliced like a cake but tasted like a classic tuna casserole, soft, creamy, salty, and familiar. The shape was the charm. It made a humble meal feel presentable, even celebratory. This was dinner disguised as a centerpiece, and for a generation raised on efficiency and imagination, that was more than enough. And when the fridge was truly bare, the shelves thin, and all you had were a few potatoes, a little butter, and half a sleeve of saltines, you could still build something warm, simple, and good enough to go around twice. Potato soup with saltine crackers and butter was the meal that showed up when the cupboards were almost empty, but hope still simmered on the stove. You'd peel and chop a few potatoes, maybe an onion if you had one, and boil them until they were soft enough to mash with the back of a spoon. A splash of milk, if there was any, a little salt and pepper, and that was it. What you got was something between a soup and a stew, thick and creamy from the potato starch alone. There were no fancy toppings, just a handful of crushed saltine crackers dropped on top, softening slightly in the heat, and a pad of butter melting in the middle like a tiny golden island. It was quiet food, humble and filling. It fed kids before payday, and warmed you up when the heater was on the fritz. It cost next to nothing, but it made people feel cared for. On the other end of the humble but fun spectrum, you had a dish that was all about resourcefulness and a little bit of paper plate creativity. Oven-style bologna boats. You'd start with thick slices of bologna, laid flat on a baking sheet. As the oven heated, the edges of each slice would magically curl up, forming little meaty bowls all on their own. Into the center of these pockets went a scoop of shredded cheese extra, mozzarella, even a broken-up slice of American. Then, a topping of crushed crackers sprinkled over the cheese like breadcrumbs. You'd pop the tray into the oven until the cheese was melted and bubbly and the bologna was crisped at the edges. They came out looking a little goofy, but they were salty, melty, and greasy in that uniquely satisfying way that only bologna can be. It was dinner made from odds and ends, but it filled the plate and made people smile. These meals, these forgotten relics of a tougher time, are more than just recipes. They are blueprints for resilience. They are a testament to the quiet ingenuity that happens in kitchens when the world outside is unforgiving. They remind us that the most memorable flavors aren't always born from luxury, but from necessity, patience, and the profound human need to create comfort and dignity, one humble, hearty plate at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, stay curious.